Anna, if you will start about the alliance.
Okay, I see that Sean has also joined now. Anyway, I can start just to welcome everybody and welcome this afternoon. We are going to have the webinar 3 in a series of 5. It's a series of webinars that we entitled Change the World, because we would like to have the ambition to be ambitious and think that through this series of conversations, of discussions, we can connect different environments that are talking about issues related to urban safety. They may not call it with the same names. They may come from different backgrounds. They may come from different disciplines and communities. But the important thing is that we all work towards the same shared goal of global urban safety. And I represent the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, of which I am the chair at the moment. This is an organization that brings together several NGOs dealing with the broad range of issues around the United Nations Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Program and beyond, based, say, physically in Vienna, close to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. For this series of webinars, we have partnered with 2 organizations that are based in Africa, with Fixed, that Barbara will introduce later, and with APCOF, we have Sean Tate from APCOF. So I may give him the floor now so that Barbara then can continue and chair this meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'd like to echo Anna's opening. Welcome, everyone. This is an important webinar in a series of webinars around looking at safety and safety promotion with regard to impacting on local and also the global agenda. And our subject matter today is particularly important around mental wellness. And certainly as we've looked at the kind of the prolonged impacts of the restrictions around 19, the stresses that it is placing on all our partners, and we discussed a lot of the partnership issues in the first webinar, are significant, and the impact that has on the lived space and people in that lived space is significant. So the discussions today are going to be particularly important, and I look forward to it. And thank you very much for making yourselves available for this input. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. So yeah, I am Barbara Holton, and I represent Fix, the third partner in the Change the World webinars. And I think really when we first started talking about this idea of changing the world, it was in response to COVID and the way that it was highlighting a lot of the issues that are apparently intractable in many cases, and that we certainly can't resolve with one single approach or without partnerships and collaborations. And we had a really interesting web discussion on that issue alone, of how partnership actually works to assist us in changing the world. And we've looked at also issues of policing, and we've looked at issues of systemic intervention. So I think today this issue of trauma and mental wellness and what it means and the impact that it has on everything we do is really, really important. And I really look forward to the conversation today. And I hope that two of my panelists, who I cannot yet see on board, will join us in time. So Nomfundo Mogapi, who is one of South Africa's leading experts on matters of trauma, and particularly intergenerational trauma, is in the process of recovering from the virus herself. And so we recorded a conversation at a time when she knew that she was feeling strong. And I'd like to start with that, because obviously if the other contributors, and indeed in our discussions, we want to respond to things that she says, I think it will be very important for us to have heard what she has to say first, specifically since she is not in a position to speak for herself.
I'm here.
You're here.
I'm here. What do you need? Sorry, somebody was whispering in my ear.
Okay, and I'm whispering in your other ear and asking you to please take us through your input before we go to the other. I'm sorry, I'm feeling very discombobulated by the issues with the technology.
No problem. Could I just get the possibility to share my screen? Could I get that possibility?
Yes, you can just share.
No, I need to, you need to open that for me. I need to be allowed.
It's open on this side.
Normally you should be allowed to.
Okay, let me just, maybe I have to do it on my computer. I don't use this system very often.
No.
I can't share my screen.
There.
But I've opened events and meetings.
You don't have a button at the bottom that says share?
Yes, it is there, and it's deactivated. It's deactivated.
Toby?
That's nothing I deactivated.
Louisa, are you?
It's nothing I deactivated for the participant.
But can you just close share for now? It's closed. We seem to be beset with problems here. Technical problems this afternoon.
Screen recording, I can't do. Maybe there's some other things I need to do to share.
Where is Boniface? Maybe he can save us. But
Boniface's computer is refusing to work.
Audio is not.
The audio doesn't work.
Well, we're just living through a trauma here.
Let me just go in and come back out, and maybe that'll work.
Well, perhaps,
We could just talk without this
Barbara,
video.
you really want, Barbara wants to test our ability to resist the trauma. May I just suggest if you have the possibility to introduce the speakers so that in the meantime they test their audio, and so by the time you finish the round, somebody will be ready to take the floor.
Okay. So I think the speakers that we have, as I said, Nomfundo is the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And her approach is one that comes from clinical psychology. And she's been working in the field of violence, peace building, transitional justice, and traumatic stress for 18 years, including issues of torture and working across different sectors. Pierluigi Sacco, who will be joining us in a few moments, is a professor of cultural economics at the IULM University of Milan, and he's a senior researcher at the Meta Lab at Harvard. He is the Commissioner for Education and Culture and a member for the European Research Advisory Board and member of various European national culture committees. And Dr. Angie Yamana is the Executive Director of Green String Network. She is a specialist in post-conflict peace building and looking really at the issues of dealing with trauma and strengthening resilience through a broader community base and building capacity within communities to strengthen institutions. Juan Fespetti is an African artist and multidisciplinary practitioner working with embodied theatre-based processes on trauma and social change. And he has worked with the Amani People's Theatre and is now also with the Green String Network. I'm going to ask, there we go, the audio coming. I'm going to ask you some questions about slides that we have that we have discussed. Okay. So the first of these slides says that sorry, I'm going to start again in a minute. So we edited this out. Oh no, I can't stand this the way you wanted to when.
That's life.
Got it right. Very good.
This week I've just told myself I'll fly with whatever happens.
Yeah. Okay, so you talk about the paradox in which there are many issues that I can highlight, but you've said that today you want to talk about the appreciation of the nature, extent and depth of woundedness within which violence occurs. What do you mean by woundedness?
Yeah. So, first of all, I think let's just chat about the paradox, because what I've been saying is that the paradox that we have in our country, but also globally, is that despite our investment in issues of urban safety and development over the past decades, we are finding this paradox that in countries like South Africa, the more we invest, the higher the levels of violence and the more unsafe people are. So in order for us to begin to make a change within urban safety, we have to unpack this paradox and address the issues that contribute to that. And my argument has been that one of the key contributors is that when we come into deal with issues of violence prevention, of safety, or even development in our cities, we don't fully appreciate both the historical and the current levels of what I call woundedness. Some people call it trauma, some people call it mental health issues, psychological issues. And I really used the word woundedness because when we went to communities and we asked them to give us a term, they called it inxeba lenhliziyo, which means the wound of the heart. So it is the wound of the heart or the wound of the soul, but the unresolved psychological and trauma issues that actually impact the interventions that we are doing. And because we haven't fully appreciated them, we haven't used the trauma lens, the trauma tends to then stand in the way and interferes a lot with our capacity to deliver these interventions.
So, Nomfundo, that woundedness extends not just to those who are the more obvious victims in a society or in our history, but how does it impact the service providers? How does it impact the police? How does it impact the officials who work with vulnerability in cities?
Yeah. So when I talk about it, I talk about appreciating that we operate in wounded contexts, and that our work, as whether we are interventionists, whether we are public officials, whether we are those in leadership, we have to appreciate that that wounded context and how it interferes with our capacity to do the work. And when I talk about woundedness, I also highlight that it's not just at a personal level. Of course, woundedness is about what are some of my own unresolved trauma issues that I come up with. The police are the simplest, the most easiest one, because a lot of them have been exposed to so much violence, even personally, that has impacted their own emotional world and how they react to things, that has affected their capacity to manage their emotions, to regulate their emotions, their capacity to respond to other people, so that they can get easily triggered by events that remind them of the trauma. But Barbara, this woundedness also is at a family level. The studies that we've done have shown that if you are a policeman or a public officer, even as a leader, when you go through really stressful and difficult times, and we know urban safety work is so difficult, when you really have a family environment that is supportive and caring, it builds your resilience and really protects you from becoming even more traumatized. But most of our families have got history of wounding because they never dealt with their trauma. And instead of being a space of support, they actually exacerbate some of our reactions. And you will hear a lot of public officers, of police, of people working with urban safety just saying, I don't have a space where I can breathe, where I can relax. And not having that can really affect our capacity to be effective. This wounded context also speaks about the institutions themselves. So you find that in some of these institutions, again, I'm using the police, there's very strong patriarchy where you can't be vulnerable, you can't show your emotions, whereas actually we know that being able to speak about your emotions and open them up helps you to be stronger emotionally and be able to deal with those challenges. But when the institution is created, its processes, its systems, is created in such a way that it hinders the capacity of the people to bring themselves and their pain, so that doesn't stand in the way, it actually becomes an issue. And in some of this society, Barbara, it's actually even historical and intergenerational. So we're dealing with just deep-seated wounding that interferes the capacity for us, first of all, for people who are service providers to do the work, but also the communities that we are trying to work with and engage with. A lot of policemen will say people just attack us because they've got a history of being failed by authorities. And it makes the work even more difficult when you are working with people that don't even trust you and you are actually here trying to assist them. So we need to appreciate all these nuances and how they impact the capacity of successful urban safety interventions in our cities.
So you talk about the implications for civil society in this, and I wonder to what extent is there an understanding, and why is it so hard for people to accept this woundedness and to accept that we need to deal differently with one another?
I mean, it's difficult because for the longest time, I think the contributor to this paradox is that we have marginalized the importance of the woundedness work. It has been seen as just a safety issues, as just a soft issue, as something that is within the avenue of social development. Also, we have seen it as just only working with vulnerable victims. It hasn't really been taken seriously enough in terms of its contribution in our core interventions. And I also say that, even with us as the people in the sector, people who work with issues of trauma and wounding, there is still work for us to learn to use a language that makes sense to people involved in developmental projects, safety projects, so they can really understand that this work is not just a soft issue. It is a hard issue. It is at the core of our work, and it has to be integrated in the work that we do.
And then you talk about leadership and the issue of the wounded and the wounding in the context of peace carriers and trauma carriers.
Yeah. So this is a topic of leadership, is a topic very close to my heart, because I think what has happened is that in countries such as South Africa, we have neglected looking at wounding generally and trauma and the importance of that in shaping our programs. But also most of the times, and I'm just always amazed how we design all these great programs to address issues of vulnerability, but we just never think about the mental state, the mindset of the people that are supposed to lead the implementation of these interventions. And studies in leadership have actually shown that in the past decade, leaders have played a critical role in the success of their institutions and the work that happens. So what we haven't done, and which we are now appreciating, is that within wounded context, leaders can either be trauma carriers, so they exacerbate some of the wounding that exists in their institutions. Trauma carriers are also people who are not awake to themselves. They haven't dealt with their own trauma. So when people come and bring difficult and challenging situations in front of them, they actually make the things that could have been contained, the crises and the challenges, unbearable. Those are trauma carriers, and they can create very toxic institutions. I mean, Barbara, the level of toxicity, I always say, that I've been seeing in our institutions since COVID-19 has been very, very concerned because of the high level of traumatization of leaders. Whereas peace carriers are the leaders who are awake, they are present, they've dealt with their trauma. And even when the trauma shows up, when the difficulty shows up, they make it bearable. They make sure that the focus becomes the purpose and the vision of that institution. They don't get caught up in the drama of conflict, in humiliating people, in shaming people, but they really focus on saying, this is what's happening, let's work towards it and be driven to the purpose, towards the purpose of our organization.
So something that I've heard you talk about before that I have found absolutely fascinating and a real prompt for me about how hard it is in terms of the othering that happens in wounded societies is how, for instance, in South Africa, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we dealt with the big and obvious crimes, but we don't seem to have mechanisms to deal with the everyday crimes, the everyday woundedness, the histories that have not, where the apologies haven't happened, where the apologies have not been accepted, where that history just drives that trauma and in a way repeats it on an ongoing basis. Could you talk to that for a moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely, and this is the disadvantage of countries that have gone through the kinds of oppression and violence that South Africa, other countries in our continent and somewhere in the globe have actually gone through. We usually come and have these transitional justice processes to try and assist us to deal with the past. But usually we focus on, you know, the extreme kinds of violence, not the day-to-day humiliations and trauma that people have gone through. End up seeing is that the past, of course, then repeats itself in just how people are treated on a daily basis. I'll give you an example, Barbara, that, you know, for me, I tell people I started traveling quite late. And when I went to some of the developed countries, what amazed me was, you know, will call an ambulance and say, I'm sick. Within a few minutes, the ambulance is there. They have a crisis, the police come and the police are there. And I would ask people and say, what message do these citizens get on a daily basis? The messages that they get on a daily basis is that you matter, you are significant, we care for you. But when you come to our countries and the way that people get treated
I'm losing you there.
on a daily basis, which is actually the repetition of the past, comes after an hour. The police don't come. It comes hours. I mean, I've had horrific incidences of people, you know, being mentally ill, the ambulance not coming, the police don't come. But the message that gets sent is you are in nothing, you do not matter. And therefore that gets repeated on a daily basis. Because if we don't appreciate the day-to-day nature of the trauma, we then don't appreciate why it's so important that we transform our institutional culture so that they become cultures that treat people with dignity, that treat people with care, that sends a message that undoes the things that happened to people during wounding. So it's very, very important for us to just appreciate that these daily attacks of our psyche and what they then do to, you know, the soul of our nation or the people that we are supposed to be working with.
And so if you look at the kind of rage and the kind of brutality that we've seen with people who disagree, even in a disagree with each other, even in a so-called, you know, fully developed culture like America, and you look at the relationship between the police and the people. Do you think that the training, that intervention for instance, law enforcement can make a difference over time? Or do you think it just needs more time?
I mean, the transformation of this woundedness cannot just happen by osmosis over a period of time. There has to be a conscious effort of, first of all, investing in being able to learn how to assess and see the woundedness and how it shows up in different countries. And I really don't want to paint this picture that it is only in developing countries, because countries like America and others have got histories of trauma that have never really been dealt with, that shows up in ugly ways. But I think what needs to be, we need to invest in is learning in our assessment, whether we are developing strategy or programming to integrate it. But in our training, I think we've done a lot of good work in training our police and other people on human rights and how they can uphold human rights, but not on how they can transform their own mindset, how they can transform the way they show up in the world, the way they treat other people, and how their trauma stand in the way. And my argument, perhaps maybe before we close, is that when you talk about wounding, people think that you are saying everyone must go to therapy. And that therein lies the problem. That's not what we are saying. We're just saying shift the way in which you are doing what you are already doing. So if you are training the police, integrate the woundedness work within the training. If you are doing performance appraisals, don't do appraisals in the way that shame people, that humiliate people, that actually feeds the wounding, but in a way that helps them to grow and develop. When you are training and developing and inducting leaders, integrate the woundedness work. Otherwise, Babs, we will still be stuck with this paradox. We will keep on investing and investing monies, but not on the people who are really the important vehicle for doing this work and their mindset. And we will find that the violence keeps on increasing despite the investments that we are doing.
Thank you so much, Noam. I really appreciate that you made this time to do this. I know what a hard time this has been for you, and that you also are in a process of recovering from the virus. And so I really, really appreciate that you've done this for us today. And
Thank you, Babs. I'm really glad that I could be able to come. I'm sorry that I'm not live, but it was really just an honor. It's a topic very close to my heart. Thank you, Babs. Take care.
Thank you, and you, Noam. Bye.
Bye.
I hope that you found that worth the wait, and that you enjoyed the conversation, and that it was provoking. I always find it inspiring to listen to Nomfundo. And now, if we can just revert to the original agenda, and I'm going to ask Pierluigi if he will please come in and give us a perspective, because one of the things that I love about Pierluigi's work is how he takes us back to the history, back to the things that we should learn from what have happened before us. So welcome, Pierluigi, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. It's a honor and really a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I think, of course, this is an extremely important issue, and I hope to be able to give a contribution. The perspective that I am taking may sound a bit odd for many of the normal ways, let's say, to look at these kinds of issues, because it will be about culture and with a specific example of theater. One could say, well, I mean, for issues which are as serious as trauma and violence, dimensions like, let's say, theater and what is generally classified as entertainment or ways to spend your leisure time sounds a bit irrelevant, or at least absolutely not to the standard in terms of the seriousness of the response, of the possibility that it opens. I would like to take a few minutes to convince you of the contrary. First of all, because the real problem is that we really disregard, we really neglect what is the real importance of culture in human life, and in particular, how culture affects us. From this point of view, let me take a few small insights, but very important in terms of impact from contemporary social neuroscience. So what we are learning very quickly about culture is that in some sense, the imagination mode that is typical of cultural experience is simply and literally our default mode. There is in particular one central structure in our nervous system called the default mode network, which in its state of rest puts us in a sort of a fantasizing kind of dimension. And this is where we normally reside. So all the aspects that have to do with conscious activity, activity planning, decision making, it's in some sense rescuing ourselves from the default state, which is this state of unconscious fantasizing. Why this is important? Because it seems that in particular our default mode network is extremely sensitive when we are put ourselves in situations in which this fantasizing becomes actual. What do I mean by this? I start from a practical example. One of the most interesting experiments that were made, for example, for the veteran rescue program in the United States after the Afghani war, for example, was a program that had to do with these veterans engaging in Greek theater, and in particular in performing, for example, the classical Greek tragedies like Aeschylus, for example. What was the consequence of this? Well, I will return on this in a moment, but I'll start from a practical consequence. They had the possibility to perform this particular program at a situation in which another group of people were involved, and this group of people were actually Afghani people that were involved in the war, but on the side of the victims. And the really interesting thing was that the laboratory in that case engaged both the military and the Afghani citizens, the Afghani civilians, in a sort of improvised act of theatrical confrontation that was not literally about their own experience, but that was clearly, let's say, an abstract representation of their own experience, a sort of, for example, of, let's say, symbolic fight on the stage. At the end of this, they were so deeply moved that it's been really an impressive example, because this has been monitored in this particular case because it was part of in some sense, of a specific social science research. What was really dramatically evident at the end of this is that the very fact that those people shared, in a certain moment, such a deeply emotionally significant experience completely changed their perception of the other. Why this is important and how theater manages to do this? Was this an exception? Was this a strange situation? The answer is not at all. This is what normally theater does. Why? Well, we know this from from Greek history already. We know, for example, that some of the crucial decisions during the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta were taken also as an influence of the recurring impact of theater representations in that very moment, taking place in the theater and reflecting in the parliament. In particular, one of the big decisions was, should we punish or spare the citizens from rebel cities once we reconquer them? And of course, the traditional approach was, no, we should basically exterminate all of them, because that's the only way to show that we are strong, that our enemies are scared of us, and as a consequence of this, we will be able to capitalize militarily on this. But of course, the other side was, yeah, but you cannot you cannot slaughter, let's say, young children and women and old people, because they did not take part in any sense in the rebellion. So this would be an act of unjustified cruelty. And the final decision in a couple of crucial moments in this war was not to exercise cruelty, but on the contrary, to show mercy from this point of view. And this was the consequence of the particular work of empathetic projection that was realized through Greek tragedy. Because, you know, think of Greek tragedy, in many cases, it's about, for example, what happens at Trojan people that were the enemies of the Greeks. So the point was empathizing with the point of view of your opponent, which does not mean justifying it, but recognizing that this opponent and its point of view is a human point of view exactly as yours. This aspect tends to be completely overlooked in the traditional behavioral schemes that are behind violence and trauma. Because, of course, the most crucial dimension that enables this violence is the dishumanization of the other. The other is not a human like you. The other is a stereotype. The other is somebody in a very vague sense, but probably is not as human as you are. And as soon as you remain in this particular situation, your brain, and insofar as this is confirmed by what you expect to see, your brain, in some sense, remains in a standard behavioral mode that never questions what you're doing. So it can happen that you can do really horrible and terrible things. You can be extremely violent, but if this happens in a mode in which you, in some sense, you don't see a human before you, this is not really creating concern. What happens, however, is that as humans, we tend to be completely put off by situations in which experience contradicts our expectations. Again, an experience coming from war veterans. In this case, during the Vietnam War, an American Marine was in the middle of a jungle, and he heard a sudden noise, and he literally saw an enemy coming towards him, and he was about to shoot. But he was stopped suddenly by the sergeant behind him, because the sergeant said, "What are you doing? It's just a small kid." And when he watched twice, he realized that what he saw as an enemy, military enemy coming towards him was actually a small child, let's say, leading a cow or something like that. The point is that our brain works predictively. Most of the time, we see what we are prepared and expecting to see, and not really what's happening in a certain kind of situation. And however counterintuitive this may sound, this is how our brains works most of the time. The point is that once you suddenly have a chance to realize that there is in this case, a gap between your perception and what's actually happening, then of course you stare at the situation and say, look, I mean, I made a mistake. So what else I did not understand of this specific situation. So this is what is called an error correcting mechanism in our cognitive process. And these error correcting mechanisms have to do with the sudden recognition of a mistake or a dissonance between what we experience and what we expect. The problem with violence and trauma is that in this kind of situations, there is generally no discontinuity at all between expectation and experience. I expect that my enemy is violent, and my enemy is actually violent. I expect that my enemy is inhuman, and my enemy is actually inhuman. But the problem is that these particular situations are in some sense self-fulfilling. Once you are into the cycle of violence, it's extremely difficult to break the cycle alone, as we know, dramatically. But what happens, for example, in a theatrical representation? In a theatrical representation, you are in a situation in which you can change the state of the things, and at the same time, the other people on the stage are, in some sense, in a mixed emotional situation. They can be scary, but they can also be reassuring, because generally this particular kind of setting works when you create situations of emotional ambiguity. So the point is that in that particular situation, you start looking at other humans from a different angle. Once you start looking at... Yes, sorry, Barbara.
Sorry, we need to...
Sure, I'm concluding very quickly. I'm concluding very quickly. So we start looking at the others from a completely different angle. What is the consequence of this? It's been experimentally shown that the consequence of this is that people are able to redefine completely the traumatic experience once it is enacted in a different way, because it creates a different experience basis for what you expect from that moment on. So what I'm saying is that culture can play a crucial role in changing this vicious circle, this spiral of expectation and confirmation of expectation and prejudice and dehumanization towards the other. The point is that we have to stop seeing theater and more generally cultural experience as something that has to do with leisure and free time, and we have to start understanding it as something that affects deeply and permanently our own capacity to prove emotions and to act. Thank you very much, Barbara.
Thanks so much, Pierluigi. I just find it so fascinating to listen to you talk about these things from that perspective, because I think very often we tend to look at things from a very narrow perspective, and that really is fabulous. Thank you so much. Andy, over to you.
So let's see if it works. Can everyone see my presentation? Okay, excellent. So I'd like to share with you quickly about our healing-centered work here in East Africa. Our work uses a trauma lens to begin to address the impacts of violence, adversity, and inequality. Just a note, there may be graphic images. We use paintings. If you feel upset by the images, reach out to a friend. I'll give you my email address. I just want to give you an idea that there will be things that may be very triggering in this presentation. I'd like to talk about one thing as I look here. Just take a look at my cup. As you can see, there's a lot of holes in my cup. And this cup is representing a community that is broken. And like the community, when you pour water into a cracked cup, it basically empties out. It leaks. And the community can't really use the water any more than I can use this water because it's leaking and spilling out. This is how chronic violence impacts communities. It appears as cracks. Think about your own communities. What kind of cracks do they have? In my community here in Kenya, we have cracks from colonialism, corruption, winner-take-all politics, bad governance. We have issues tied to violent crime, violent extremism, and every 5 years, the violence of elections. In Kenya, donors have spent billions of dollars tending to our cracks. And yet after 15 years of being here in Kenya, the cracks actually appear larger than when I first came. Why is this? Even with all the outside aid that appears there, why is this? And now I'm going to show you a number of the images and pictures that we use on a regular basis. I think there's somebody who's on, who might want to just mute themselves. There, Anne-Marie, want to mute yourself. Sorry. So our whole life witnessed and heard the stories of violence, destruction, and despair remained in our homes, institutions, and society from colonial decades many years ago. Then there's the man-made natural disasters like the houses that fall down in whole communities when it rains and because of poor building standards. The images of young people rioting and feeling like they don't have a future. Our systems of law and order are also broken and leave us feeling like we can't trust systems that are meant to be safe. And the police, like Namfundo actually talked about, they take it home and it impacts their families and their loved ones. It also has them target and transfer it to the citizens that they're meant to protect. Young girls are becoming pregnant and losing their futures. Sexual harassment and violence is found in the workplace. In Kenya today, rape and sexual assault is a huge part of our culture and it's rampant. Every 5 years, we turn against each other with the political violence that happens. And the war on terror is hard to distinguish from human rights abuses. Poverty exists everywhere you turn. And what this has caused is that we as Kenyans have become a nation of victims. And this is where the mental health issues become everyday issues in the lives of everyday people. Our suicide rates among the youth are exploding. We are depressed and live in broken families. The normal addictions of alcohol and drugs are making things worse, not only for us with those with addictions, but for those in the families. the daily stress of life, many of us are working ourselves to death to pay for lives we can't afford. We distrust our neighbors and our fellow citizens, and many feel hurt, excluded, and betrayed by our own government. Many of these young men who are at this funeral have made the decision to join the jihad because they don't have a place in their home country. As seen in the last painting, the cycle of victimhood leaves people to be those that hurt others. Acting out and hurting others gives us new victims. The cycle never ends and only grows. It impacts both victim and those who hurt the victims, but also those who hurt others. We're all impacted, and we're all on both sides of this line. This is the work that my organization in Kenya, the Green String Network, has done. We've worked at the community level, but we've also worked with the Kenyan police in starting to do some of this healing processes at a very informal grassroots level. We see our work as a healing movement. It isn't a program, it isn't an intervention. It becomes a movement because that's actually what we need. And all of these people, all of these names that you see on this slide, these are the people that we see we want to target with this work. Because without targeting a multidisciplinary approach of the targeting, we end up in the same silos and not actually being able to move forward. So how do we do this? We've created new ways of working. We use the paintings that I've already shown you, visual arts and storytelling. We decided to move away from always doing workshops, so that we want to move to really what is community healing. The new format's a 12-week format led by community volunteers. Groups meet for 2 hours, they talk, they share, they heal, they dance. The 12 weeks conclude with a call for everyone to leave that cycle of victimhood because that's where we all exist, and to choose to be resources for peace. The materials were adapted to context and culture and to the environment. Our volunteers are people who already hold the spaces. They're the mama and nisas who hold spaces regardless of what is happening in their community, and we tap into those existing networks and continue to build on those strengths. And they will be there when the funding leaves. The healing circles are owned and directed by group members. They decide what they want to discuss, how long they'll spend in their weekly group sessions. The participants are volunteers as well as the facilitators, and the facilitators are members of their community. And we'll get this in a little bit when Bonnie comes to talk. But when we're not living in this little reptilian part of our brain, our survival brain, and we're able to access this healing part, the rational brain, our parietal lobe, we're actually being able to not just survive, we can thrive. And at that point, we bring creativity and innovation into problem solving. And that's what we've seen in all of our communities. The two women sitting there on the right, they're two of our facilitators who just opened like almost a little transitional justice at the neighborhood level at the Chiefs camp, where people could come on Thursday afternoons and talk about their conflicts with their neighbors. Nobody asked them to do that. They're still doing it today, 3 years later, because they believe that's where they can help their neighbors have a more peaceful life. During a global collective trauma summit in October 2019, Dr. Christina Bethel noted, we're a society organized based on trauma. So we need to go from being trauma organized to being trauma informed, and eventually we'll get to healing centered. Understanding that many people hurt others out of their own real and perceived victimhood. So a little bit about what was just being talked about, that perception that our brain sees something that's not really there. Each of us begins to reflect on what each of us have crossed that line, and we begin to empathize with that other. In our experience, it begins to give people choice. And when choice is peeled back, we begin to see real healing processes happening where people realize they have a choice not to engage in violence. I'm just going to end here with a number of the paintings. So we do show the victim and the hurting other paintings, but the other paintings that are there for people to live into and see that healing processes take place on a daily basis are the last paintings I'm going to show you. These are what peace and security look like or can look like in our context. This shows the truth-telling photo exhibit that was exhibited across the country after the post-election violence in 2007 and 8 in Kenya. This is elders sitting under the tree, laughing and being neighborly, and just being able to enjoy each other's company. Family support and loving each other. The police embodied dancing as they live in celebration and are happy. Local economies that work for our villages and in our rural homes. You'll see a lot of paintings of families because we believe that if we heal the families, we will heal the nation. There's a hope that justice systems work, and even if there are improvements, we can see how things actually do work here in Kenya versus many of our neighbors. Community security. And this is an image of the memorial, of the August 7th Memorial Park in downtown Nairobi that memorializes the terrorist attack that happened in 1998, I think. And this last picture actually shows the moment in 2008 when all Kenyans took a deep breath when Baba, Mr. Raila here, and President Kibaki had that famous cup of chai, the famous cup of tea. Just in conclusion, I want to show you a little short film of Mama Zoria and show you what this work actually looks like at the community level. We're doing this with police, we do this with youth. Mama Zoria's backstory is that her son disappeared to Somalia. And when he came back, he was either assassinated by Al-Shabaab or by the police, nobody knows. And Mama Zoria came into this program a very pained and hurt person, but I'd like to share with you her short story. It's about 4 minutes long.
I want you to breathe 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Feel you are in a safe space, and you open your eyes when you are ready, and tell me how you feel. Never. Naitwa Zuria Omari na nimetoka sehemu ya Majengo. Mimi ni mama na ni nyanya. About kumekucha it's about trauma. Mimi sijawahi kusikia kitu kama hiyo. Zile siku wakati zinaposonga nilijikuta yale mambo ambayo kwamba nilikuwa siwezi ongea kwa community ama na marafiki ama na watoto ama na nani, nikajikuta naweza kuyaongea mbele watu. Yalikuwa ni mambo ambayo kwamba yalinipitia katika maisha yangu, nikazirewind, lakini nilikuwa nimezifungia. Nilikuwa sina mtu wa kuambia, tulikuwa tumezifungia kwa roho. So hiyo training ilifanya nikafungua hiyo maneno. Na wakati wa kutoka kwa hiyo training tuliambiwa tutafute watu ambao kwamba weko na uzito kama sisi. Ile safe space walikubali kwamba haya maneno hayatatoka nje, na tuliaminiana na tulienda pamoja mpaka 12 sessions. Pia kulingana na zile picha ambazo kwamba tulikuwa tunapewa za kufanyisha training zilikuwa zikiwagusa sana, manake most of them walikuwa kusema huyu ni mimi, hii ni mimi. Huyu ni mimi. Kusema kweli topics zote ziliwagusa, isipokuwa ile iliwagusa sana mjane. Wakati wa maisha magumu ama mambo umepitia magumu, tulikuwa tunaweka stones. Wakati kidogo mambo inaenda vizuri, kwa tunaweka flowers. But for Mwajina ilikuwa ni ngumu sana, hakuweka flowers. The whole journey ni kama ilikuwa two stones. Trauma ni nyingi. Kuna matukio ambayo kwamba yanaweza tokea ikawa mpaka utashikwa na wazimu. Kuna matukio ambayo kwamba yanatokea unaweza kujiachilia. Yani wewe sasa umekata tamaa na maisha. So hii program ilitu boost katika haya yote. Ndio mwisho wa mambo kutukumba. Lakini sasa in case ikitokea mambo kama haya, tuna njia, tuna vile tunaweza kabiliana na mambo. Lakini challenges lazima ziko. Ningeomba kila mmoja ambaye kwamba anasikia hii kumekucha aje, tuko tumetrainiwa, maparticipants wetu tumewatrain, waje tujifunze sote, bado tunaendelea kujifunza na singeomba ishi, na I hope itasaidia wengi, na twende mpaka mashinani huko tutoe watu ambao wanajua.
Oops. And with that, I just want to say that my cup that's repaired, it gives me choice. And Mama Zuria today has choice that she didn't have before. And when you have that type of choice, you don't only see violence. You can actually choose nonviolent paths. And that's what the healing process does. It peels back that choice. And so if I want to drink my water, I can. If I want to pour my water on Bonfist, if I want to water my garden, I now have a different level of choice. And I think that's to us what really healing is about. So thank you very much. I'm glad I was able to find a way to share this. I don't know how to.
Thanks so much, Angie. I'm so very glad that you were able to share it. I think what these presentations are doing, I hope for all of us, but certainly for me, is making us think about the issues that underlie safety, that we cannot ignore, and yet they don't necessarily fit into the normal set of strategies that we use when we talk about urban safety. So I'm going to ask Bonnie, where is he?
He's here right next to me, don't worry.
Okay. And ask Bonnie to take us into a completely, different way of us thinking about the issues of trauma. Thank you very much.
Let me just get Bonnie kind of tuned up, and then he's going to take us forward. I just have to figure out how I do this. Okay. There we go. Share that. Here you go, and here's Bonnie.
Hi everyone, I had to remove Angie because my computer refused to work, so I'm also using Angie's computer. She came to my rescue. Okay, so I want to tell a story about the green leopard and the hare. So, long time ago, in the wonderful lands of Kavirondo in African savanna found in Kenya, there lived the green leopard. But before this, it's important to realize that animals in the jungle live together peacefully Everyone cared for each other. There was serenity. Every evening they had their parties. They will sit together, sing their music, play their drums, and dance. And all the animals in the Kavirondo land, they always spoke about peace. And they said people should live in peace in this country. And they also made a treaty that no one was going to eat any other animal. They will all be vegetarians, vegans in this land of Kavirondo. But this went on for a very long time. But something strange happened in the land of Kavirondo. One day, Green Leopard came out of his cave and decided to take a stroll by the stream that went to the river that fed everyone in the whole community of Kavirondo. But as he came, he found the elephants grazing by the roadside. But he also found the hare, and he did not even bother about the hare, but there was a gazelle. So the gazelle, Green Leopard told the gazelle, "Gazelle, today I have just got some different feeling that I have to start eating animal meat." Green Leopard. So he started to think about eating other animals on that day. But guess what? He told the gazelle, "I want you tomorrow to go home to your house, slaughter for me your firstborn child, make very nice soup for me, and bring it by the cave, by the door to my cave." So the gazelle was worried. He started to really cry and was so shaken to think about how he could only sacrifice his firstborn child to the Green Leopard. But Green Leopard said, "You have to do this, and you don't have a choice." Gazelle went and he brought his child as a nice meal to the Green Leopard's cave door, and Green Leopard had the child for dinner. He did the same to the ostrich. The ostrich brought his child to the Green Leopard. And finally, it was the turn of the hare. So they met as he strolled down the river to take a shower. And he said, "Hare, you have to give me a meal. Tomorrow it's your turn. I need to have a nice, juicy meal. And guess what you're going to do? You're going to offer me a nice meal by slaughtering your own child, and that will be my meal." But Hare decided to trick Green Leopard to change the story. In the land of Kavirondo, as the day to bring the child came, the hare disappeared. He went to hide deep into the forest. And the Green Leopard was so wrath, he was so mad, and he said, "If I get this little tiny hare, I'm going to tear him to pieces and eat him alive." And this day, the hare did not show up anywhere. But a week later, Green Leopard met with the hare, and he said, "Now, hare, I have to eat you." Hare said, "No, don't eat me. Please wait. I have to explain something, because in our rituals and oracle, if you eat me, for listening to my story, my meat won't taste good in your mouth." So Green Leopard was tricked, and he said, "Okay, now tell me what you are talking about. Let me find out what you are saying, you foolish hare." And then Hare said, "Let me tell you, the day you asked me to bring my only child to you, I did exactly what you wanted. I slaughtered my own child. I prepared a nice barbecue meal for you, and I brought that meal by your door. And guess what happened? I met another mean Green Leopard just like you, who said this kingdom belonged to him. And he said he wanted to snatch the kingdom from you." And Green Leopard, all of a sudden, his color changed, actually, because he never used to be green. So his name, he lived true to his name now. He used to be a different color, he was brown. Now he became Green Leopard because of anger. And then he said, "Show me this other Green Leopard you're talking about." So Hare took him to the river. He said he went to the river, and Hare found where the river was so deep. He tricked Green Leopard and he went closer to the river bank, and he told Green Leopard, this guy just went into this river here, into this water. Green Leopard was mad. He saw his own reflection in the water. And guess what? He jumped into the water, started to fight with his own shadow, reflection in the water. And every time my grandmother told me this story, she slept, so she never finished the story. So I will not be able to finish the story myself. So I will ask you a question. I'll ask each one of us a question. What will you have wanted to happen to the green leopard? If you are the one, what would you have wanted to do to the green leopard? Maybe people can post in the chat. I can see, or you can say it. One person maybe. What would you have loved to see? What would you have done to the leopard, green leopard?
Does anyone want to offer an end to the story?
Okay. All right. What we have heard from many places when we talk about this story is people have told us that if I was the one, I would leave the green leopard to die, to drown and die in the water because of being cruel and treating other animals unfairly. You know? And some other, it's very little people who have said that I will save the green leopard. But I just want to say, maybe because of time, our work really presents this kind of paradoxes. So I told this story actually one time as we worked with because we work with the police, as Angie was explaining. I told the story in one circle sitting, and one police officer told me, actually, she told me that I remember a story about young people who had committed violent crime that I was sent to arrest. And I regret today that I never shot them dead. Because if I knew, I think they were just like this green leopard, I would have shot them dead. But then that was the first day on a Monday. So I didn't want to go deep into talking so much or arguing, debating with her about why she felt like that. But I just let it sit down with her during the sessions. On Wednesday, she actually told me that she had thought about it and she knew that killing those young people or shooting them dead, because that is the order of the day, where because of chronic violence in our country, would mean that she later came to realize that that will not be able to break the cycles of violence. So this story teaches us very clearly that that justice becomes like a paradoxical thing where there is chronic violence. And many people say that we want justice. When we work with police officers, they tell us they feel very let down by citizens because they feel like citizens don't really respect or they don't value the work they are doing for the citizens. Like this lady in the session, she felt like if we don't maybe shoot dead these young people, the rates of crime are not going to go down. These young people, she said, they had been brought to the station because they had broken into someone's home, they had raped people, and they had even like injured someone. And she was the one given the task of taking care of them at the police station. But she came back and she found one of her colleagues had let them loose. He had allowed, like, sort of, he had opened the cells for them to escape. And that made her so regret that she would have actually shot them dead when she was with them at the station. So these are some of the dilemmas that chronic violence and the trauma that comes along with that presents for community members that we work with every day, police officers as individuals, but also at police institutions, where the issues of justice, for example, becomes very, very difficult. Talking about many people always think about justice like revenge. So you think about retributive justice, but also now trauma healing-centered approaches gives us opportunity to think about restorative justice, where, for example, you think about the needs of perpetrators. How do we take care of the needs of perpetrators? Psychosocial approaches many times don't really deal with this kind of issues. Perpetrators, they always provide for the needs of victims more often. But our work helps us to look deeply and reflect deeply on how the impacts and the traumatizing impacts of chronic violence, especially for individuals and communities together. Yeah, I think I'll end there and my presentation there.
Thank you so much, Barney. It's such an interesting thing for me, the way that throughout these presentations, there is so much storytelling. There is so much of an attempt to connect people, to, I suppose, present humanity to each other instead of shutting down. And yet, as Nomfundo has told us, there's such a lot that is intergenerational, and therefore we need formal interventions of one kind or another to actually make ourselves more open to the empathetic approach to dealing with trauma in such a way that that we don't perpetuate it. And I was talking to you, Pierluigi, about that, about empathy, and particularly when it comes to the issue of policing. And I'd really like it if you would reflect for a moment on what you said about why perhaps it is so hard for us to extend our empathy to essentially state violence, to those who, if, as Bonnie has said, and Nomfundo also referred to, if it is a cycle of violence that we're dealing with, can we afford to exclude any of the people within that cycle when we try and look at a restorative approach, which would surely be better for all of us than an approach that is based on conflict, hatred, anger? Are you there, Pierluigi? We lost you. No. He is there, but I'm not sure.
Sorry, Barbara, you were asking about me?
Yes, sorry. I was
sorry.
Just saying there's so much storytelling in all of this, and the circumstances in which we find ourselves today are really so much about punitive justice, and we see it, and we see that all of you who have spoken talk about how investment in cities, investment in law enforcement, investment in justice systems doesn't help us break the cycle of violence. And so I was really wanting you to, and you and I had that interesting conversation about how it is that we bring ourselves to share that approach with, for instance, the police who are currently, or law enforcement generally, who are currently such a massive problem in terms of their brutal responses to the issues in our cities.
So, Barbara, you want me to comment on this?
Yes, I want you to comment.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. So I have an example. Nothing can be as dramatic as the stories that I have heard, but in my little chunk of experience in Europe, we have For example, we have had some problems with, for example, with organized crime in Sicily, with mafia. And what we have learned in that particular case, and I think it could report back to what we are discussing now, also in terms of the urban dimension of safety, is the notion of public space. Because the problem is exactly what is a public space and how people are entitled to use this public space. The first thing that breaks down in cycles of violence is the notion of public space as a safe space that you can inhabit. And in that particular case, one project that proved to be, for example, there was one town that was really plagued with this kind of mafia-related control. And they started a very interesting project that was a school of architecture for children. And it was about teaching children how to use the public space. Why this was particularly important? Because once children started to feel entitled to use the public space and they communicated this need to families, the consequence of this was that the families themselves started to be urged to be in the public space because the children, in some sense, had learned how to use it and they wanted to use it. And so this point of breaking the cycle of violence, starting from children education in ways that make of the children the change agents, in this particular case, could be a way to tackle the problem from a completely different perspective, and especially in a way in which, children don't have realistic expectations. Children want to play in the right sense of the word. They have to develop their competencies, their skills, they have lots of energy and enthusiasm. And I think that in this particular case, focusing on how we can re-inhabit the public space, where the public space really becomes also the space of exchange, of experience sharing, as I was saying before, in some sense is the ideal stage, also from the point of view of the theater. Well, I think that this could be something that is can be of particular interest, and we have a few examples where reclaiming the public space in the right way has really been the way of rebuilding a community. Barbara, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I saw that, Jean, you had Linda first. You had a question about non-state torture. I wonder if you would like to talk about that at all.
Yes, hello. It really, I guess it wasn't a question, it was more of a comment about the work that Jean and I do, Jean Sarson and I do about non-state torture, which is an extreme crime. And the women are often tortured from infancy. But they also need to know that it's not just trauma that they've endured. It's also a crime. And it's a human right violation, and that seems to broaden and enhance their healing because they feel like they're connected globally to others who have endured torture. And the naming is important as well, because if we don't call it a crime, they don't realize that there is an injustice often. They just focus on the harm that they've endured. So it holds the perpetrator accountable, takes the blame away from them as well. So it's just one of the concepts that we've learned in working with women in non-state torture. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. I wonder, Angie, if you might like to add to that. Respond to it.
I think naming it, I think that sometimes we make trauma a thing where trauma is not a thing. Violence, chronic violence, injustice, and inequality are the things. Trauma stops us from being able to move forward and heal and find those cracks, but it's not necessarily the thing. And I like what you said, that by naming it, we found that by groups getting together and naming their issues, the level of agency of those groups begins to form. There's a South African friend of mine who is a psychologist who's become a peace builder later in his life. He said that working in groups increases the ability to seek justice. And I think that's a really important process, like you said, with the naming of crime, of this was something that was wrong. And so when we look at breaking that cycle, we look at a wide variety of things, of truth, of justice, of forgiveness, of peace, of reconciliation, and all of those, like what Bonnie did with the story, is we use a folktale to actually talk about what those things are, because those are the nonviolent approaches, and truth and justice are a piece of that. And there's a point in our work where we ask people, well, where would you start? Do you start with truth? Do you start with justice? Do you start with peace? And everybody ends up on a different corner. Nobody starts in the same place. And that's the beauty of this kind of work, is that everybody brings their pieces to it. If there's a level of acknowledgement and healing, and people being able to say, I'm ready to acknowledge the past, but I'm also ready to dream of the future and the present. That's where I think that we're getting to. And I really love that the naming is so important in the work that you do.
Thank you. I think that there's a really interesting thing here about peace building, and we've had. I think that we've had discussions in our previous webinars about the importance of peace building, and again, it's about naming it. I guess that if we talk about urban safety, whose safety are we talking about? If we talk about peace building, somehow for me it has a different cadence to it. There is something bigger than safety. I've always said that for me the issue of crime prevention is problematic because the best you can aim for is no crime. With peace building, the best that you can aim for is something so much bigger than no crime or no violence. And so I wonder if anybody wants to contribute to that conversation about what is the difference between peace building and urban safety, and how do we ensure that we are including peace building in our objectives and in our interventions. And I think that these trauma interventions are obviously absolutely central to that. I don't know if any of you would like to respond to that. I'm hoping that you would.
I can respond if you like, if no one else wants to. I think peace building and freedom, I like freedom too, the concept of the reality of freedom. Jean and I called our work Flight into Freedom when we first started. And I think that's why the human rights is so important, and the relationship with self, because you can't always have forgiveness if the person is not willing to be forgiven, if they're not sorry. But you can accept that they have done wrong, have harmed you, have perpetrated a crime, and then move on accepting that you're free from that reality, that it wasn't your fault. And I think if we strive for peace and freedom in our communities, it will take us much farther than just a crime-free, as you say, because the crimes are going to be endless over our evolution anyway. So focusing on peace and freedom is a healthy way to go. But I do think that the naming of all the crimes that we endure need to occur for us spiritually to heal within. It's a spiritual healing as well. That's very important in the naming. And it gives us freedom, internal freedom.
That's really useful. Emma, sorry, yes?
Yeah, I want to go to the issue of the social space. And I think for the women we work with, that Linda and I work with, the naming of the crime has to be part of creating social space. Like the women tell us, we're from Canada, and the women that we work with are Canadian women. Plus, we hear from women from from Western Europe, from the UK, from the US, who are all talking about the same non-state torture victimization. And what they tell us, if the law does not name their crime, they feel that they are excluded. They often tell us, I feel like a freak because my country is not accepting that I suffered torture by non-state actors. They're trying to tell me I suffered something else. So I think in naming safe space, the law that we name has to be important too. So I just wanted to add that to Linda's conversation. And I would like to add at the same time just to value the storytelling, because for us, it is crucial for the women who have healed. And to the story of rescuing, I put in a little comment there in the chat that we developed a rescuing intervention, and it is about safety, because the women tell us when they were children and they were tortured by individuals or groups, they were alone, totally powerless, helpless, nobody to reach in or to see what was happening to them. So in their memory, they're stuck in that captivity state. So to use a way of helping them reframe that, we developed rescuing always at the end. When the women had finished telling their story about their victimization, we would create a rescue so they weren't locked into that memory. They had a new storytelling that they were rescued and somebody realized that they were in trouble and rescued them. So that has a social context, because as much as we help individually, if we don't go into a social culture that is caring, they are still alone, if you will, because the larger society is not open to accepting them. So I think that has a lot to do around peace and safety. So I'd like to share that, because of course the women that we work with aren't on this, are in the chat, so we can only bring their voices to share with everyone else. So thank you for everyone who has contributed.
Okay.
Barbara, we cannot hear you.
Yeah, I wanted to just go to Emma's question, if there was a moment, if we have a moment very quickly to look at the relationship between the debates and arguments about defunding the police versus an issue of healing from trauma. Em, do you want to say something about that?
I know, I was just wondering whether there have been platforms on which the issues of police trauma have been linked to police brutality, and whether, you know, I mean, just sort of in response to Nomfundo's, or in light of Nomfundo's structure of the difference between the peace builder, the peace carrier, and the trauma carrier, where the peace carrier is part of the response to the worldwide crisis with police brutality.
I think
if somebody wants to respond to that.
I think a lot of the reason we are working with the police right now is exactly that, that the violence has become so deep within the system. So the suicide rate in Kenya with our police officers is so high. The homicide rate of juniors killing seniors, the domestic violence. What the police have started to realize is that trauma that's not transformed is transferred, and it's now eating them alive. And that's the one reason that they've worked with us to develop the program that we have. Everybody says, how did this happen? It was the moment in time when the police said, we will no longer function. And the brutality is now so much within. It's not only without. We have a lot of Kenyan police brutality issues. But we also have so much that's now hurt them inside. And I think that's been the point where the police themselves said, we have to stop. We can't keep doing this because this is no longer it's no longer functional. And they acknowledged that. And they drew their own cycles of violence. They made their own stories. They made themselves not only victims, but also those who hurt others. And they told those stories. And that was a very, very powerful process where young men who had been on the receiving end and police officers began to write those stories together.
You. And yeah, I think that I remember having a discussion with a policeman in Alexander Township here in Johannesburg a long time ago. And he showed me the wounds on his head where during the apartheid era, he was a black policeman, and during the apartheid era, he had been required to protect, to have an antagonistic relationship with his own community in protecting the state, and that he had burning objects thrown at him. And he was talking about how hard it was for him to actually move forward in that space, considering what had happened to him. And I always think of that in terms of how we actually break that cycle. And who takes the first step towards reconciliation in a world where law enforcement has become such an issue. So we've got 5 minutes left, and I would ask each of our participants to please just take 1 minute to sum up or give us one interesting thing that they have that they want to say in this last 5 minutes of our chat. So if we can start with you, Boniface, if you are there, and then we go to Auntie and then end with Pierluigi, if that's okay.
So Boniface has run away. His children were knocking at the door, and he needed to run them upstairs. My last takeaway is that healing is possible. It's not only possible, it's necessary. I think some of the things that we've learned with the isolation of COVID is that we need each other, and that we need each other for the healing process. In the same way that our brains use the fight, flight, freeze, way of surviving, the other thing that our brain is wired to do is to connect to humans and to connect to others and to build relationships for survival. And I think that's what we have to concentrate on, how to get beyond just survival to thriving, is to actually dig into that human trait that we have that's born into our DNA.
Thank you. I think that's really important and a great comment for summing up. If you might give us a closing thought.
Sure. First of all, thank you, because I really learned a lot today. And I also see how big the responsibility is in speaking about issues like this. So the only thing that I would like to say at this point as a closing remark is that we have incredible resources as humans in terms also of giving sense to even the most terrible experiences, even healing in such prohibitive circumstances. If we are mindful of the kind of resources that really our emotional activation can generate in suitable circumstances, this can be of great help. So I think it's important to think seriously of culture as a real resource from this point of view. This is something which we have not explored enough that can really do a lot for us to address these terrible issues. But thank you very much for sharing all these experiences.
Thank you, Pierluigi. And I think one thing that stands out for me is that, and that we perhaps haven't discussed today, but that comes from this issue of broadening our approaches towards dealing with the terrible things that happen to people, is that recovery is possible. And that I think if we focus on peace building, if we focus on connection, on building through culture, if we focus, I mean, I love to focus on children and on intergenerational healing, then hopefully we can, in the long run, have a society that is much safer, although our interventions are not necessarily coming from the same perspective as most of those that deal with urban safety. So thank you all very much for today. I apologize again for our technology glitches at the beginning. And thank you very much for everyone who has participated. I agree with Pierluigi. I too have learned a lot this afternoon. So thank you. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.